Imagine a world so dark, so lonely, that even the air feels heavy with sadness. This is Rusty's world, a poor dog chained in a muddy yard, forgotten by everyone. His fur is dirty, his body is weak, and his heart is breaking. Night after night, he shivers in the cold, hungry and scared, with no one to love him. The chain cuts his neck, the shadows whisper creepy things, and his cruel owner wants him gone. Rusty's story is full of pain, heart-wrenching moments that will make you cry. But then, a mysterious cat appears, small and wild, with glowing eyes and a torn ear. What she does next is a miracle that will touch your soul and restore your faith. This 5-part tale is about survival, friendship, and hope in the darkest places. Every word will pull at your heart, every twist will keep you hooked. If you feel Rusty's struggle, if you want to see how a little cat changes everything, please like this story and subscribe for more. Join us on this emotional journey, you won't forget it. In a small, forgotten village, far from busy towns and bright lights, there was a dog named Rusty. He wasn't a fancy dog with a shiny coat or a wagging tail like the ones you see in happy homes. No, Rusty was a scruffy brown mutt with tangled fur and tired eyes. His home wasn't a warm house with a soft bed. It was a muddy, stinky yard behind an old, broken-down shack. Rusty was tied to a rusty metal pole with a thick, heavy chain. The chain was so tight it dug into his neck, leaving red marks on his skin. He couldn't run, he couldn't play, he couldn't even lie down comfortably. That chain was his prison, and it had been that way for as long as he could remember. The village was a quiet place, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind of quiet that made your skin crawl. The houses were old, with cracked walls and windows that stared like empty eyes. The trees around the village were twisted and bare, their branches reaching out like bony fingers. At night, the wind howled through them, making sounds that Rusty didn't understand, sounds that scared him. Sometimes, he heard strange noises in the distance, low growls, sharp cries, or footsteps that didn't belong to any person he knew. Rusty didn't know if they were animals, ghosts, or something worse. All he knew was that he was alone, and the dark made everything feel bigger and scarier. Rusty's owner was a man named Old Tom. He wasn't a kind man. He was tall and thin, with a face full of wrinkles and a voice that sounded like gravel crunching under boots. Old Tom didn't care about Rusty. He never petted him, never talked to him, never even looked at him with anything but anger. Rusty didn't know why Old Tom kept him around. Maybe it was to guard the shack, but Rusty wasn't much of a guard dog anymore. He was too weak, too hungry, too tired. Old Tom hadn't fed him in days. The last thing Rusty ate was a dry crust of bread. Old Tom threw at him a week ago, and even that was covered in dirt. Rusty's stomach growled all the time now, a loud, empty sound that hurt his insides. He licked at puddles in the mud when it rained, but the water tasted bitter and made him feel sick. The yard where Rusty lived was a horrible place. The ground was always wet and slimy, full of sharp rocks that cut his paws. There was no grass, no flowers, just mud and trash. An old broken chair sat in one corner, its legs sinking into the ground. A pile of rusty cans and bottles lay near the shack, buzzing with flies. The air smelled bad, like rot and damp wood. Rusty's chain only let him move a few steps in any direction. He could walk in a small circle around the pole, but that was it. The chain clanked every time he moved, a loud, sad sound that echoed in the empty yard. Sometimes Rusty pulled on it, hoping it would break, but it never did. It was too strong, and he was too weak. Night was the worst time for Rusty. During the day, he could at least see the sky, even if it was gray and cloudy. He could watch birds fly overhead, or see a squirrel dart across the yard. It wasn't much, but it was something. At night, though, everything changed. The dark swallowed the village whole, the shack turned into a black shape with no edges, and the trees looked like monsters waiting to grab him. Rusty's eyes weren't very good anymore. He couldn't see far, but he could feel the darkness pressing in. It felt heavy, like it was sitting on his chest, making it hard to breathe. The noises got louder at night, too. Once he heard something big, moving through the bushes behind the yard. It snapped twigs and growled low, and Rusty's fur stood up. He barked, but his voice was so weak it barely made a sound. Whatever it was didn't come closer, but Rusty didn't sleep that night. Rusty used to bark a lot. When he was younger, he'd bark at strangers, at birds, at anything that moved. He thought maybe someone would hear him and come help, but no one ever did. The village was too small, and the people who lived there didn't care. They walked past the shack sometimes, their heads down, their coats pulled tight against the wind. They didn't look at Rusty. They didn't stop to say hello or toss him a scrap of food. Maybe they were scared of old Tom, or maybe they just didn't see Rusty anymore. He'd been there so long, chained to that pole, that he was like part of the yard, something you stopped noticing after a while. Now Rusty didn't bark much. His throat was dry, and barking hurt. His barks had turned into little whimpers, soft cries that he couldn't hold back. He whimpered when he was hungry, when he was cold, when the chain rubbed his neck raw. He whimpered at night, when the shadows moved, and the wind screamed. He didn't know who he was crying to, no one ever listened, but he couldn't stop. It was all he had left, that tiny sound, a way to say he was still alive, even if no one cared. The worst part was the loneliness. Rusty didn't remember much about his life before the chain. He had fuzzy memories of a warm place, maybe a house, and a soft voice that called his name. But that was long gone. Now there was just him, the pole, and the dark. He didn't have friends, the birds didn't stay long enough to talk to, and the squirrels ran away if he moved. Old Tom wasn't a friend. He was a shadow that brought fear, not comfort. Rusty felt like he was disappearing, like the world had forgotten him. He wondered if he'd die there, chained up, alone, with no one to even notice he was gone. One night, as Rusty lay shivering in the mud, he looked up at the sky. It was black, with no stars, just thick clouds that blocked everything out. He closed his eyes and let out a long quiet whimper. He didn't know how much longer he could keep going. His body hurt, his heart hurt, and the dark was closing in tighter than ever. He didn't know that something was watching him from the shadows, something small, something quiet, something with glowing eyes. That night, Rusty thought he was alone. He didn't know his story was about to change. Rusty's life had become a blur of cold nights, empty days, and the heavy chain around his neck. The muddy yard behind old Tom's shack was his whole world now, a small dirty circle he couldn't escape. His fur was matted with mud, his paws ached from standing on sharp rocks, and his stomach growled louder every day. He was so weak he could barely lift his head. The village stayed quiet, the people stayed away, and old Tom only came out to yell or throw something at him. Rusty didn't hope for anything anymore. He just waited for what, he didn't know. Maybe for the end. Then one night, everything changed. It was a stormy night, the kind that made the village feel like a haunted place. The sky was black, covered with thick clouds that rumbled and flashed with lightning. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, turning the yard into a swamp of cold, sticky mud. The wind screamed through the twisted trees, shaking their branches like they were alive. Rusty huddled against the pole, his body shaking from the wet and the cold. The chain felt heavier than ever, pulling him down into the muck. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the storm, but the noises wouldn't let him rest. Thunder boomed so loud it hurt his ears, and the wind carried strange sounds, whistles, howls, and something that sounded like a faraway scream. That's when he saw it, two glowing eyes in the dark. They appeared suddenly, like tiny lanterns floating in the shadows beyond the yard. Rusty's heart jumped. He squinted through the rain, his weak eyes struggling to focus. The eyes didn't move, they just stared at him, bright and steady, cutting through the storm. Rusty's fur stood up, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. He didn't have much strength left, but he wasn't going to let something sneak up on him without a fight. Was it a wolf, a fox, one of those things he'd heard in the bushes before? His growl was shaky and quiet, more fear than threat, but it was all he could manage. Then the eyes moved closer, lightning flashed, lighting up the yard for a split second, and Rusty saw what it was. Not a wolf, not a monster, but a cat. A skinny black cat with wet fur and a torn ear. She stepped out of the shadows and into the edge of Rusty's little circle, her paws sinking into the mud. She wasn't big, smaller than Rusty even, but there was something about her that made him uneasy. Her eyes glowed like they held a secret, and her body was tense, like she was ready to run or fight. She didn't look friendly, she looked wild, like she belonged to the night and the storm. Rusty stopped growling, but he didn't relax. He didn't trust her. He'd never had a friend, never known anyone who didn't hurt him or ignore him. Why would this cat be any different? She didn't come closer, she just sat there, a few steps away, out of reach of his chain. The rain poured down on her, flattening her fur, but she didn't seem to care. She stared at Rusty, her glowing eyes locked on his. It was creepy. Rusty didn't know what she wanted. Was she hunting him, waiting for him to die so she could eat him? He'd heard stories from the wind, whispers of animals that ate the weak when they couldn't fight back. His tail tucked between his legs, and he whimpered softly, too tired to do anything else. The cat didn't move. She didn't hiss, didn't meow, didn't blink. She just watched him. The storm raged on, lightning flashing and thunder shaking the ground, but she sat still as a statue. Rusty's heart pounded. He didn't understand. If she was going to attack, why didn't she do it? If she wasn't, why was she here? The longer she stared, the more he felt like she could see right through him, see his hunger, his fear, his loneliness. It made him shiver, and not just from the cold. There was something spooky about her, something that didn't feel normal. Her torn ear twitched once, but that was it. She was a shadow in the rain, a mystery Rusty couldn't figure out. When the storm finally calmed down, the rain slowed to a drizzle, and the wind quieted. The cat still didn't leave. She stayed there, sitting in the mud, watching Rusty as the night stretched on. He didn't sleep, he couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt those glowing eyes on him, and he'd snap them open again. She didn't come closer, but she didn't go away either. By the time the sky started to turn gray with dawn, Rusty was exhausted. His body hurt from shivering all night, and his neck burned where the chain rubbed it raw. He looked at the cat, expecting her to be gone, but she was still there. She stood up, stretched her skinny body, and then turned and disappeared into the shadows without a sound. Rusty didn't know what to think. He lay down in the mud, his head spinning. Who was she? Why had she come? He didn't feel safe, but he didn't feel as alone as before. It was confusing. That night, he thought it was a one-time thing, a strange cat passing through, caught in the storm. But he was wrong. The next night, she came back. No storm this time, just a quiet, cold darkness. Rusty heard her before he saw her, a soft rustle in the bushes, and then those glowing eyes appeared again. She sat in the same spot, just out of reach, and stared at him. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched. It happened the night after that too, and the night after that. Every night, she came back, silent and spooky, like a ghost that wouldn't leave. Rusty started to wonder about her. She didn't act like any animal he'd seen before. She didn't run from him, didn't try to steal the little scraps old Tom sometimes threw out, didn't do anything but sit and stare. Her eyes made him nervous, but they also made him curious. Was she real? Was she a spirit, like the ones he'd heard about in the wind's whispers? He didn't know. All he knew was that she kept coming back, night after night, watching him through the dark. And even though it scared him, it was the first time in a long time he didn't feel completely forgotten. The chain still held him, the hunger still gnawed at him, but now there was something else, something strange, something new. Rusty didn't know it yet, but the mysterious cat was about to change everything. Rusty's days and nights had settled into a strange pattern. The chain kept him trapped in the muddy yard, the hunger gnawed at his belly, and the cold sank into his bones. But now, there was the cat. Every night, she came back, those glowing eyes appearing in the shadows, her skinny black body, sitting just out of reach. She never got closer, never made a sound, just stared at him, with that eerie, unblinking gaze. Rusty didn't know what to make of her. She scared him, with her torn ear and wild look, but she also made him feel less alone. He started looking for her, when the sun went down, his tired eyes, scanning the dark for that familiar glow. It was the only thing he had to hold on to, a tiny spark in his miserable world. But that spark didn't make everything better. Rusty was still weak, still hurting. The chain rubbed his neck until it bled, and his paws were sore from standing in the mud all day. Old Tom hadn't fed him in over a week now. The last time Rusty saw him, the man had stumbled out of the shack, muttering curses, and kicked an empty bottle into the yard. It hit Rusty's leg, leaving a bruise, but Rusty didn't even yelp. He was too tired. He just lay there, watching old Tom stagger back inside, the door slamming shut behind him. That was days ago. Rusty didn't know if old Tom was even alive in there anymore. The shack was silent, its broken windows dark and empty, like a dead thing watching over the yard. The night everything went wrong started like any other. The sky was clear, with a few stars peeking through the clouds. The air was cold, and Rusty's breath came out in little puffs. He was curled up as tight as he could get, the chain pulling at his neck, when he heard the cat's rustle in the bushes. Her glowing eyes appeared, and she took her usual spot, sitting in the mud, staring at him. Rusty lifted his head a little, his tail giving a weak twitch. He didn't know why, but seeing her made him feel a tiny bit stronger, even if she never did anything but watch. He settled back down, his eyes half closed, listening to the quiet sounds of the night, the wind in the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the creak of the shack's old wood. Then the door to the shack banged open. Rusty's head snapped up, his heart racing. Old Tom stumbled out, his tall thin shape swaying in the doorway. He was drunk. Rusty could smell the sharp sour stink of alcohol from across the yard. Old Tom's face was red, his eyes wild, and his hands were clenched into fists. He was holding something, a long sharp stick, its end jagged like it had been broken off a tree. Rusty's stomach twisted. He'd seen Old Tom angry before, but never like this. The man's voice roared into the night, loud and rough. "You useless mutt, everything's your fault, ruining my life," sitting there like a curse. Rusty whimpered, pressing himself into the mud. He didn't know what he'd done wrong, he never did. Old Tom staggered closer, his boots splashing in the puddles, the stick raised high. Rusty's body shook. He was too weak to run, even if the chain let him. He couldn't fight back, couldn't bark, couldn't do anything but cower. Old Tom's shadow fell over him, huge and dark, blocking out the stars. The stick came up higher, and Rusty closed his eyes, waiting for the pain. He'd been hit before, kicked, slapped, shoved, but this felt different. This felt like the end. He braced himself, his whimpers turning into a soft, broken cry. Then a scream split the air. It wasn't Rusty, it was something else, something wild and terrifying. Rusty's eyes flew open just as the cat leaped from the darkness. She was a blur of black fur and claws, her glowing eyes burning like fire. She landed on Old Tom's chest, her scream turning into a hiss that sounded like a ghost wailing. Her claws slashed at his face, fast and fierce, tearing red lines across his skin. Old Tom yelled, a mix of shock and pain, and stumbled back. The stick fell from his hand, landing in the mud, with a wet thud. He swung his arms, trying to hit the cat, but she was too quick. She jumped off him, landing on the ground, her back arched and her fur bristling. She hissed again, loud and sharp, her teeth glinting in the starlight. Old Tom clutched his face, blood dripping between his fingers. "You devil, you little monster," he shouted, his voice shaking. He took a step toward the cat, but she didn't back down. She stood her ground, her eyes locked on him, daring him to come closer. Lightning flashed in the distance, lighting up the yard, and for a moment Rusty saw her clearly, her torn ear, her skinny body, her claws ready to strike again. She looked like something out of a nightmare, small but fierce, a shadow come to life. Old Tom froze, his breath heaving, then turned and ran back to the shack. He slammed the door so hard, the whole building shook, and Rusty heard the lock click into place. The yard went quiet again. Rusty's heart pounded in his chest, his body trembling. He stared at the cat, his mind spinning. She'd saved him, she'd stopped Old Tom when Rusty couldn't. But how? Why? She was so small, so thin, how could she scare a man like that? The cat turned to look at him, her glowing eyes softening just a little. She licked her paw, calm as if nothing had happened, then sat down in her usual spot. Blood stained her claws, but she didn't seem hurt. She just watched Rusty, silent and still, like always. Rusty didn't know what to feel. He was scared of Old Tom, of the cat, of what had just happened. The air felt heavy, like the night itself was holding its breath. He'd never seen anything like that scream, that leap, that fury. Was she a normal cat, or something else, something from the dark, something that didn't belong in the world he knew? He whimpered again, his voice small and shaky, but the cat didn't move. She stayed there, her eyes on him, guarding him through the night. When morning came, Old Tom didn't come out. The shack stayed silent, and the cat was gone, vanished into the shadows like she always did. Rusty lay in the mud, his body aching, his mind full of questions. The stick still lay where it fell, a reminder of how close he'd come to something terrible, and the cat, whatever she was, had stopped it. Rusty didn't understand her, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of something new. Not hope, not yet, but something close. The horror of the night lingered, but so did the mystery of the cat. The days after the horrible night with Old Tom were quiet, but not peaceful. Rusty lay in the muddy yard, the chain still tight around his neck, his body weaker than ever. The memory of the cat leaping at Old Tom played over and over in his mind, her scream, her claws, her glowing eyes. She'd saved him, stopped the stick from crashing down, but Rusty didn't feel safe. The shack stayed silent, its door locked, and Old Tom didn't come out. Rusty didn't know if the man was hurt, scared, or just too drunk to move. All he knew was that the yard felt emptier, colder, and more lonely than before. The cat's attack had kept Old Tom away, but it hadn't changed Rusty's prison. He was still trapped, still hungry, still fading. The chain was worse now. It had always been heavy, but after so long, it was cutting deeper into his neck. The skin underneath was raw and red, with little spots of blood mixing into his dirty fur. Every time he moved, it hurt, a sharp stinging pain that made him whimper. His paws were sore, too, cracked from standing in the wet mud, day after day. He couldn't walk his little circle anymore. He just lay there, curled up as tight as he could, trying to keep warm. The cold sank into his bones, making him shiver, even when the sun was out. His stomach growled louder than ever, a constant ache that never went away. He hadn't eaten since that crust of bread weeks ago, and his body was giving up. His ribs stuck out under his fur, and his legs felt like they couldn't hold him anymore. The cat kept coming back though. Every night, when the sky turned dark and the village grew quiet, Rusty heard her soft rustle in the bushes. Her glowing eyes appeared, and she sat in her usual spot, just out of reach of his chain. She didn't do anything different at first, she just stared at him, silent and spooky, like always. But Rusty started to notice something. She wasn't just watching anymore. One night, she came closer than she ever had before. She stopped a few steps away, her head tilted, and then dropped something in the mud. It was a tiny scrap of meat, no bigger than Rusty's paw. She backed away fast, her eyes never leaving him, and sat down again. Rusty stared at the meat, his mouth watered, and his stomach twisted with hunger. He didn't know where it came from. Maybe the cat had stolen it from a trash pile, or caught something small in the woods. He didn't care. He stretched as far as the chain would let him, his nose barely reaching the scrap. With a weak lunge, he grabbed it and swallowed it whole. It wasn't much, but it was the first food he'd had in so long. It warmed his belly for a little while, and he looked at the cat, his tail giving a tiny wag. She didn't move, didn't meow, just watched him with those glowing eyes. Rusty didn't understand why she'd done it, but he was too hungry to question it. The next night, she brought something again, a piece of bread, crusty and dry, but food all the same. She dropped it closer this time, then backed off to her spot. Rusty ate it, his jaws shaking as he chewed. It happened again, the night after that, a bit of fish skin, slimy and smelly, but he didn't care. He gobbled it up, his eyes locked on the cat. She kept bringing him things, little bits of food she must have found or fought for. It wasn't enough to fill him up, but it kept him alive, day by day. Rusty started waiting for her, his heart lifting a little, when he saw those eyes in the dark. She was still spooky, still wild, but she was helping him. For the first time, he felt like someone cared, even if it was just a little. Then one night, everything changed. The cat came as usual, her eyes glowing through the shadows. She was carrying something in her mouth, a small chunk of meat, bigger than the scraps she'd brought before. Rusty's stomach growled, and he lifted his head, watching her, but as she got closer, he saw something wrong. She was limping. Her front paw was hurt, dragging in the mud. When she dropped the meat near him, Rusty saw blood on her fur, dark and wet, dripping from her leg. She backed away slower than usual, her body low, and sat down with a soft hiss. Her glowing eyes dimmed a little, like she was in pain. Rusty's heart sank. He ate the meat, but it didn't taste good anymore. He kept looking at her, at the blood, at the way she held her paw off the ground. She'd hurt herself for him, she'd gone somewhere dangerous, fought something, or climbed something sharp, all to get that food. Rusty's eyes filled with tears. He didn't know cats could cry, but he felt like he was. This skinny wild cat, with her torn ear and fierce stare, was risking her life to keep him from starving. She didn't have to. She could have left him, ignored him, let him die, but she didn't. She came back every night, even when it hurt her. Rusty barked softly, a weak, raspy sound. It wasn't a warning or a growl. It was a thank you. He wanted her to know, he saw what she was doing, that it mattered. The cat tilted her head, her eyes glowing again, but she didn't come closer. She just sat there, licking her bloody paw, her body small and fragile in the dark. Rusty lay back down, his chest tight. He didn't understand why she cared. He was just a chained dog, a nobody, a thing old Tom hated. But the cat didn't see him that way. She saw something worth saving, even if Rusty couldn't see it himself. The truth hit him hard. She wasn't just a spooky shadow or a wild animal. She was his friend, the only one he'd ever had, and she was hurting herself to help him. It broke his heart, but it also lit a tiny fire inside him. He didn't want to give up anymore. Not for himself, but for her. The chain still held him, the yard still trapped him, but the cat's quiet kindness gave him something to hold on to. As the night stretched on, Rusty watched her, his tears mixing with the mud. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing: he wasn't alone anymore. Rusty's world had shrunk to the muddy yard, the chain and the cat. The little scraps she brought him, meat, bread, fish skin, kept him alive, but just barely. His body was a shadow of what it used to be. His fur hung loose over his bony frame, his legs wobbled when he tried to stand, and his neck was a mess of sores from the chain. The cold nights were getting worse, creeping into his bones and making him shiver non-stop. He didn't know how much longer he could hold on. The cat's kindness gave him a reason to keep going, but his strength was slipping away, like water through his paws. He felt it every day, a heaviness that pulled him down, a tiredness that wouldn't leave. The village stayed quiet, wrapped in its creepy stillness. The shack loomed behind him, dark and silent, since old Tom's attack. Rusty didn't know if the man was still inside, dead or alive. The door never opened, and no sound came from the broken windows. The trees around the yard twisted in the wind, their branches scratching the air like claws. At night the strange noises Rusty used to hear, the growls, the cries felt closer, louder. He didn't have the energy to bark at them anymore. He just lay there, his head on his paws, waiting for the cat's glowing eyes to appear. She was all he had left, the only light in his dark, lonely world. One night, the cold was unbearable. The sky was black, with no stars or moon, just a thick blanket of clouds. A sharp wind cut through the yard, stinging Rusty's skin and making his teeth chatter. He curled up as tight as he could, but it didn't help. His breath came out in weak puffs, and his eyes felt heavy. He hadn't seen the cat yet that night, and worry gnawed at him. She'd been hurt last time, her paw bleeding, her limp slowing her down. What if she didn't come back? What if she'd gotten caught, or worse? Rusty whimpered, a soft, broken sound. He didn't want to lose her. She was his friend, his savior, the only one who cared. Then he heard it, a faint rustle in the bushes. His head lifted, his heart jumping. The glowing eyes appeared, faint at first, then brighter as the cat stepped into the yard. She looked different tonight. Her body was lower to the ground, her movements slow and shaky. She was dragging something with her mouth, something small but heavy. Rusty squinted through the dark, his weak eyes struggling to see. She came closer than she ever had before, her torn ear twitching, her breath fast and ragged. When she stopped, just a step away, she dropped what she was carrying. It clinked against a rock, a rusty old key, its edges worn but sharp. Rusty stared at it, confused. The cat nudged it with her nose, pushing it toward him, then backed away. Her eyes glowed, but they were dimmer, tired. She sat down, her bloody paw held up, and watched him. Rusty's mind raced. A key. What did it mean? He looked at the chain around his neck, then at the lock hanging from the pole. It was old and rusted, just like the key. His heart pounded. Could it be? He stretched his neck, the chain pulling tight, and nosed the key closer. It was cold and slimy from the mud, but he didn't care.
With his last bit of strength, he pushed it toward the lock, fumbling with his snout. His paws were too weak to help, so he used his teeth, clumsy and shaking.
The key scraped against the lock, missing at first. Rusty's breath hitched. He tried again, his jaws trembling, his body screaming with effort. Then, click. The lock popped open, and the chain fell off his neck, landing in the mud with a heavy thud. Rusty froze. He was free. After so long, the weight was gone. He staggered to his feet, his legs wobbly, his head spinning. He looked at the cat, his eyes wide. She'd done it. She'd brought him the key, stolen it from old Tom's shack, dragged it through the dark, risked everything to set him free. Tears welled up in Rusty's eyes. He barked, a weak, raspy sound, full of gratitude and wonder. The cat meowed back, just once, soft and low, her first sound since he'd known her. She stood up, limping on her hurt paw, and turned toward the shadows. Rusty took a step after her, his legs shaking but moving. He didn't want her to go. She'd saved him, not just from old Tom, but from the chain, from death. He owed her everything. The cat paused, looking back at him, her glowing eyes soft for the first time. Then she ran, disappearing into the bushes, her black shape swallowed by the night. Rusty followed. He didn't know where he was going, didn't know if he'd make it far. His body was weak, his stomach empty, but his heart was full. He stumbled through the yard, past the shack, into the trees. The wind howled around him, carrying those eerie noises, but he didn't stop. He could smell her, the cat's wild, faint scent, and he kept going, one shaky step at a time. The village faded behind him, its dark houses and twisted trees growing smaller. Ahead, the woods were thick and scary, but they were free. No chains, no poles, no old Tom. Rusty didn't know what would happen next. He was still hungry, still hurt, but he wasn't alone anymore. The cat had given him a miracle, a chance to live, to escape the horror of the yard. As he walked, his tail wagged, just a little. It hurt, but it felt good too. He thought about her, her torn ear, her bloody paw, her quiet courage. She wasn't a ghost or a monster. She was a friend, a tiny hero, who'd seen him when no one else did. His faith, broken by years of pain, came back, piece by piece, because of her. The night stretched on, cold and dark, but Rusty kept moving. Somewhere ahead, he knew she was waiting, watching him with those glowing eyes, guiding him to something better. He didn't know where they'd end up, but it didn't matter. For the first time in forever, Rusty felt alive. The chain was gone, the yard was behind him, and the cat's miracle had set him free.